Today we are graced with the presence of Mr. David Fahey, who will be giving us an insight into a very interesting topic called the new era of education, nature versus technology. So thank you so much, Mr. David, for being here with us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
All right. So before delving right into the topic, I think it's only fair if the audience knew a little more about Mr. David. So allow me to introduce Mr. David. So Mr. David is a high school teacher currently at GEMS International School in Penang, where he specializes in teaching both geography as well as psychology. He also holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science, PGCE in Secondary Geography, and is a qualified teacher as well as a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. Due to Mr. David's passion in education, he actually quit his PhD and his job as a part-time university lecturer to become a secondary education teacher. Adding to that, he also holds a Bachelor of Science in Psychology and a Master of Science in Investigative Psychology, and to top it all off, an MBA as well. As of now, he remains a certified business psychologist, accredited by the Association of Business Psychology in the UK. And his interests, broadly speaking, is using technology to modernize geography education, nature-based learning, as well as, I think this was very nicely put, dragging schools into the 21st century. So once again, thanks, Mr. David, for being here. And I guess we can dive right into the topic. So I guess the first question would be, what actually defines nature-based learning in terms of education?
Yeah, it's a good question, and the most basic question to start with, right? We need to define nature-based learning, and I guess that might mean different things to different people. For me, it's about exposure in an educational setting to the natural world. Now, this might be done outside in a river or a rainforest, but not necessarily. It's also possible to bring the outside in. So, for example, I might be talking about some frog spawn in a fish tank from outside, where students can learn and interact with that piece of science and do things with that and learn about nature in the classroom as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to be outside. That would be my preference. But I think that exposure to the natural world in a learning context defines it for me.
All right, thanks, Mr. David. I think I guess I agree with you as well. When we're looking at today's times where everything is online and we're all staring at screens 24 hours a day, I guess with that exposure to nature, doesn't matter whether it's outside or inside. I think there's a new element of learning which we can use on. So I guess my next question would be, as we know, technology has evolved, and since the onset of the pandemic, we've utilized technology as evidenced by the podcast we're having right now. I'm guessing you're in Penang and I'm 400 kilometers away in the city center, and yet we're still able to have this podcast. So How do you think technology has shaped our education today?
I think technology has always been shaping education. I think it's not new. We are in this digital era now, perhaps, but technology doesn't have to be digital. I was talking to some engineer friends of mine just last week, and we talked about a spade, being a technology. Something made out of wood is still a technology, and it's been influencing education, I think, since the long 18th century, which is a period that we refer to as the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. And this is where, in a Western context, there was a move away from believing in fate, that everything was written, and it was basically it was really rooted in biblical studies, in Bible studies, and so with the emergence of these Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke, Sir Isaac Newton, we started to realize that actually, you know, we have more agency in our control over our destiny. And so this led to this thinking, which was no longer rooted in religious dogma, and ultimately led to the Industrial Revolution, which began in the UK. But also at the same time, I'm not particularly well versed in this, but in the East, China was certainly recognized as being a very advanced society as well. So I think education has always been influenced by technology. What's happening now is not new. It's always been there.
All right, thanks for that, Mr. David. So when we're looking at the evolution of technology, especially when you look at the consumer market of like smartphones and computers, we see a dramatic increase in how they've evolved. You know, I remember when I was, I think, about 8 or 9 when the iPhone 3GS was first introduced, and that was like the first touchscreen phone, and we were all going nuts about it. And then now almost everyone is using a touchscreen phones, and it's like nothing new. So we look at technology from that aspect, and we see a dramatic increase in how it's evolved. Yet when we look at the classroom, in a classroom setting, it's always a teacher and a group of students, and that has not evolved. So it could be saying that this method is so good that it does not need evolving, but maybe there could be something else that is going on. So is the traditional method of education still suited today, or would you prefer an education method in which you have incorporation of both nature-based learning as well as technology?
Sure. So I'm definitely in, no, I don't think that education got it right 200 years ago and therefore has no need to change. I think that what you have just identified there is a real problem. And I don't think this is necessarily a technological question. It is just more of it's a more holistic question to ask. And it was Tom Hirk, who's an educational consultant, and his quotation was 21st century children being taught by 20th century adults using techniques and a curriculum from the 19th century within a calendar from the 18th century. And that is what's happening in schools right now. That is what's happening. But this is not just in schools. My background is that I came from industry, and I moved into a university, and I saw what was going on there, and then I moved further back into the school system, because I think that schools are not preparing young people for university or alternatives to university, and universities are not preparing young people for work, for what employers need. So I think there is a huge disconnect between the different phases of education and ultimately employment. And I think from a technological perspective, one of the issues with this, we have a lot of technology. It's ubiquitous. I mean, you mentioned the iPhone. I can still remember getting my first email in 1998. And so this has actually moved on much faster than even you might be aware of. It's only 23, 24 years on all of this has kind of really moved on an enormous amount. But what I see a lot of kids interacting with technology, but they're users. They're not innovators. They're not creators. They're merely consuming what other people have done. It's kind of worrying, because my father was a detective in a narcotics squad, and there are only 2 industries which describe their customers as users. One is the drug dealing industry, and one is the software industry. And I think that one of the things that education needs to do, or play a role in certainly, is to convert those young people from being mere consumers, mere users of this technology, into doing something useful with it.
All right, thank you, Mr. David. I think that was quite insightful, and I agree to a certain extent where the drug business and the you can equate it one to the other in terms of being called users.
I can't think of any other two industries that actually refer to their customers as users. And but if you think about it as well, social media. I mean, you guys are medical students, right? So if you think about social media, for example, this has not been designed by psychologists with people's mental health being at the core. This has been designed by engineers to addict people. And so we have a situation now where people are addicted to likes. It affects the number of likes that children get, or not just children, people in general, can affect their mood, can affect their level of happiness. And so, I think that actually the parallel is perhaps uncomfortably deeper than just the surface aspect. And this is just an element of there is an element of addiction there with how young people interact with certain types of digital media.
Yeah, that is true, and I guess it would be a good discussion for another day. But building on your topic on how you mentioned where schools aren't preparing students for university, and then it goes on and on. So I think we would just like to know what your ideology is of education, what it should be, and maybe what factors actually influence you to have this sort of ideology.
Okay. I think that I'm using my Malaysia experience right now. I think that, and I think that this is largely cultural. It's more than just schools. It's bigger than just schools. It's societal. It's structural. It's cultural. But right now, children are being trained to pass exams. Okay. That's the skill that they are developing, to pass an exam. Now, when you get out into real life after you finish school, that's a pretty useless skill to have, like, passing an exam. I mean, not many mums and dads would say that they've, spent the last week passing exams. And so I think that the whole, and I was also speaking to a colleague of mine who teaches design and technology. So he's actually working with real things, and it sits in the art department. But actually, there's a lot of science and engineering that goes into what he does as well. And he noted that that he gave an A-level student a set of components, and asked him to put them together, put these components. And it was just some basic principles of physics to make it work. That student could not put those things together. He had no practical skills. Now, where does this? But I can sort of take this back to much earlier on in my life. I did an environmental science degree. My degree I was fortunate. My degree was very practical in its nature. I also it was a 4-year degree, and my 3rd year was spent in industry. So I was trained by an organization to use scientific equipment, various spectrometers, flame ionization detectors, all kinds of instrumentation to be able to measure atmospheric pollution. And so I learned the theory at university, and I got some practical use, but I really got hands-on experience outside. And then I took that back to university in my 4th year. And after that, I went to work for the same company because they'd invested in me for a year, and I had the skills that they needed to be work ready. When I taught at university, before I moved into high school teaching, I saw a real disconnect between, I felt like I was teaching high school geography, year 9 geography to students who were 19, 20, 21 years old. And I just thought to myself, how far can I take this back? How far does the problem go? And so I guess it's the sum of my experiences which has led me to where I am. In terms of the nature part and the technology part, I think that we're spending too much time on screens. I think that we are in evolutionary terms, we've not been removed from nature for very long. All of this has happened very, very quickly. And I don't think that we are designed to be so detached from nature. And I think this is causing lots of social problems, mental health problems, etc. So my kind of whole approach to education is to bring these together, to try and how do we gel? Because technology is not going anywhere; it's here to stay, and it's useful. But how do we gel that with what we know to be healthy and good for us, but also make it useful later on in life when we've completed our education? So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. David. I think that's rather refreshing to hear. And I guess it brings me to my next question. So you mentioned that in your third year of your degree, you got the nature aspect of it because of the hands-on experience, whereas, you know, in the previous years of your degree, it was more technology-based because of the theory that you know, you've learned and acquired. So you're able to use that. And I guess when you combine the nature aspect and the technology aspect and go hand in hand, I guess that's why, you know, in your, like you mentioned, in your fourth year, you managed to bring the hands-on experience to further aid your learning. So I guess the next question would be, how do we intertwine perfectly both nature and technology? Where is the fine line or the balance, and how do we actually do it?
I think that working in nature has always necessitated the use of technology. For example, as a geographer, I might be interested in why a river floods. Or why does the Klang Valley flood every year? And so in order to answer this question, which is a complex question, I will need to go and do some science. I will need to go and take some measurements. I will need to get into that river. I will need to understand what the rivers. I will need to do some work on the river's cross-sectional area. What's its cross-sectional area? I will also need to understand how quickly that water flows. I'm using technology to measure this all the time. I might also want to take some basic chemistry from there. I might want to understand the biological oxygen demand or the chemical oxygen demand of the water. I might want to know what the pH is, for example. I'm using technology all the time in order to be able to do this. I think within geography, but geography itself has always been a technology-driven subject. Not in schools, and that's the problem, because it's not in schools. But if you look at the weather forecasting industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry around the world, crucial for aviation, crucial for shipping, crucial for agriculture, it's geographers that lead this together with engineers, because they create the data, you know, the measurements and the data processing that needs to take place on supercomputers to manage huge amounts of data 24 hours a day. So I think it's always been a case of nature and technology. You know, the two have never been where I think the disconnect is there isn't a huge, schools are failing, education is failing because it's not exposing children to concepts like, for me, geographical information systems have been around for quite a long time now. You know, they are the basis of sat-navs. When I was at university, they were relatively new. In schools, though, you still find people doing their geographical. So this is layering maps on top of each other. So I might have a geological map and a relief map and some economic data on top of that, for example. But what we're still seeing in schools is tracing paper. So to create an additional layer of map, we're seeing tracing paper. There's no interaction with the software. Even though access to that software through organizations like ArcGIS or open source such as QGIS, it's free. It's free for schools to use. Teachers are not taking it up. Teachers are not leading their students down that avenue.
All right, thanks, Mr. David. So I guess it all depends on on actually using the readily available technology in order to benefit the students?
I think so. Students have to be exposed to it. They have to know where it is, and it's amazing. When they do know where it is, when they do know how to use it, the young, the generation of school children now, they're far more intuitive with technology than I am, because they've been born into it. They can pick it. What might have taken me, I don't know, a week to learn before I taught that lesson, they've picked it up in 20 minutes, and so, but if they don't get the exposure to that, and they don't get the understanding of how that bit of technology connects to their basic geography knowledge, what does that tell us about, how can we interpret that through our knowledge of geographical process and pattern, then it's always going to be a bit of a problem. And I think teachers have to get out of their comfort zones there. Teachers are very much not doing this. Why aren't they doing it? Because the exams don't demand it. And students just want to pass their exams so they can get a grade A, even if they leave with no particular skill, as long as they have a grade A. So this is problematic for me, because as a business psychologist, I was designing psychometric instruments and assessment centers to try and look at individuals more holistically, not just their exam grades. So it all ties in with what I used to do there as well.
All right, that's very insightful, Mr. David. I'd just like to bring the discussion now to a bit on online learning and online classes. So, especially with the pandemic now, I think majority of the institutions have moved on to online learning. And I guess, it puts all the students in a very technologically based cage where they're not exposed to nature. So I just wanted to know your thoughts on online learning, and even with after the pandemic dying down, as you know, Malaysia is technically moving towards an endemic stage right now. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on online learning? Should it be continued after this? If so, how do we make it better?
I think it's a difficult question to answer because it depends. The answer is it depends. And I think it depends on the demographic of who's learning. I think it's really dangerous to continue this with young people. I think it impacts them negatively in terms of social skills, their ability to interact with other people. I think it isolates them in their bedrooms, for example, or in one space. I think it makes it very, very hard for us as education professionals and specialist practitioners to assess progress. The students making. They're hiding behind chat boxes rather than speaking verbally, rather than using their microphones. It's very easy for students to just say, "Oh, my mic's broken," just because because it's easier to say that than "I don't have the confidence to speak up." And it's also they're just their basic organizational skills. If you contrast that with a classroom environment, I might start a lesson by putting up a photograph of an earthquake and asking students at their tables to discuss and write down as many questions as they can about that photograph. So that is kind of really, I think, it's a danger with younger people. I think we need to get them back into not traditional classrooms, because I'm sat here arguing against traditional classrooms, right? But there are huge benefits to children from working together, from collaborating together, and there is only so much you can do from behind a computer screen. There's only so much that teachers can do. There's only so much that they can do. When you're behind a computer screen, you are not in a river. You are not in a forest. You are not up a mountain. You get no sense really of what it's like from actually being there, looking at it on the screen. So I think that, but if you say blended learning, is it good for a university student who has more life experience, who has established friendships, who might have, somebody who works and they might want to do a degree by distance learning, then, programs such as this now, the medium that we're talking through now, has opened up a huge number of new possibilities for this to be more interactive for them. So instead of studying in isolation as a distance student, they are able to interact with their peers and their lecturers far more in a far more meaningful way than they could before. So again, just to sort of come full circle, the answer to that question, is online a good thing? Should it be here to stay? Yes, it is here to stay. Is it a good thing? It depends how it's used. But I think the demographic, the age of the student, is very important.
All right, thank you, Mr. David. I think I would agree with you on that one. Considering I think most of us here are medical students who spend, I think, about 1.5 years of online learning. Yeah, I guess, when you actually go back, like you mentioned, when you see that the picture of the earthquake and all these questions start coming. So I guess the same applies to us as well.
And it's not a multi-sensory experience, is it, either? You're looking at a picture which is in 2 dimensions generally, but you can't smell it, you can't hear it, you can't touch it.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah. So, Mr. David, I'd just like to know, as since you have experience as a investigative psychologist, and since the topic today is on education, so I just wanted to know how heavily education plays a role in terms of molding a person, and how do you see nature-based learning as a tool to shape a person's future?
There's plenty of research to say which demonstrates that students participating in science outdoors, so a biology class outdoors, do better in their exams because they are getting a much more holistic experience and understanding of what it is that they're doing. So the notion that they just, you just have to stay indoors, in a classroom and to do exam papers to get your grades, I don't think it really is supported in research. I think that, just repeat your question again, please, if you would, Joel. I'm thinking.
All right, sure. Yeah, I just wanted to know how heavily education plays a role in terms of molding a person. So this is from an investigative psychologist's point of view, and how does nature-based learning help with that?
So from a psychologist's point of view, it's there's plenty of most of the theory that teachers that make up teacher training courses is actually developed not by teachers but by educational psychologists or psychological researchers such as Piaget, Bandura, and it's really important for developing language and cognition are very closely related. I'm firmly of the belief that language is not just a reflection of our thoughts. Language creates our thoughts. It constructs and it's constructive. So you and I talking together are creating a reality between us, and we're negotiating an understanding between us. You're not just getting a reflection of my thoughts. We're building concepts together through conversation, and that is a really important aspect of a child's education. It develops that ability to think critically, and I think that is where that's kind of the big hurdle that the current uses of technology have to we have to get over. How do we use technology in the classroom in such a way that it is interactive and it supports critical thinking rather than stunts it? I think it's easy. The easy way around that is to, how does it work in nature-based learning? Well, we know that being outside is good for us. We know that interacting with insects and plants is a healthy thing to do. But you could take the principles of coding, for example, to create an app, say, which helps, which children can go outside with. They can develop the app, and they can identify what a particular butterfly is, or what a particular beetle is, or what a particular plant is by taking a picture of a leaf, which is then fed back into a database, which then brings that, oh, this is what this is. And you might have other data there, it's that plant's ability to fix nitrogen, for example, so you could have, other data there. You could look at which plants coexist with one another, and also when you start to look at the ecology, insects and plants have developed very much together. So certain insects are essential for particular plants, and without that particular insect, that particular plant can't propagate. So it's, you can bring all of these things into that. You could, from a geography perspective, be using ArcGIS, for example, linked with Survey 123, where students can be putting information into an app, which then drops that into a map. And then by looking at that map, they can start to see patterns. They can start to see how, visually, spatially, what does that data look like? Where are the surpluses? Where are the deficits, for example? It might be access to water, for example, access to drinking water, something as simple as that. But students are then outside in nature, and they're using technology. Now, it doesn't have to stop there. The students can decide themselves what question are they going to investigate. What is a good question to investigate? And a good question is a question that has a complex answer. So they can then generate lots of additional questions that will help them answer that question. And then in order to do that, when they've done that, they can form hypotheses. And then they can start to look at the technology that might help them go about finding out, those answers. So it doesn't have to be static desk research in a classroom. That can certainly be some of it on the internet. But actually taking this mobile technology out into the environment and doing something useful with it to collect original novel data, which they can then draw original conclusions from, and then perhaps even have a call to action, with the local community. For example, around GIP, I've often said that instead of having caterers in, the kids could have done a project to locate all the sources of locally grown healthy vegetables in our proximity and drop those onto a map. And then could they then make a pitch to the principal of the school to try and have those growers supply our school, our kitchen, in order that, and then the school becomes a good community partner, interacting with other local businesses, all done by kids being outside using technology to collect useful data to answer a good question.
All right, thanks, Mr. David. I think that sounds like a wonderful idea as well. So speaking of bringing technology into the outside world, oftentimes when we look at education in geography, it emphasizes a lot on like case study excursions, field trips, in order to understand the discipline better. So, and then bringing technology in, are there any other ways, technology can provide a more immersive learning experience? So perhaps virtual reality comes into play, and does it offer the same amount of depth and realism? If not, what are some of the pros and cons as well?
Yeah, so does it offer the same amount of depth? Clearly not. No, it doesn't, is the short answer to that. That's easy. Is it therefore useless? Absolutely not, is the short answer to that as well. It has a place. And I can think of a couple of situations where that might be the case. You can't take a bunch of kids into an erupting volcano because their parents probably wouldn't sign the consent forms for us to do that, right? We can't take them up a mountain. And so what it does, or we can't take them into the aftermath of an earthquake. However, with virtual reality, we can. And one of the ways that I've done this is in a couple of years ago, I went to Iceland, and Iceland sits on the Mid-Atlantic Rift. So There you have two tectonic plates pulling apart. The North American plate is pulling apart from the Eurasian plate, and lava comes up and fills the gap. Now that's all under the Atlantic Ocean, apart from in a couple of places. And the most significant place where it breaks the surface has formed Iceland. And you can actually swim in the fissure between two tectonic plates in Iceland. So you can go diving, you can go snorkeling. So I did this, but I also took lots of GoPro footage and turned that into a virtual reality experience for the kids to see what it is like inside a plate boundary. Yeah, where the Earth is pulling apart. It's hard to get kids to do that. One, because potentially it's dangerous, but secondly, there's a lot of underprivileged kids that will never have the opportunity to do this. And this is also my my pitch for technology like virtual reality having an important place in modern geography classrooms. Is that children can experience have a much more authentic experience of a place that they would never normally be able to get to, perhaps for distance reasons or for financial reasons, and a much more authentic experience than they will get from just looking at a photograph in a textbook. And as virtual reality becomes more advanced, there are just more and more opportunities to be able to do that. What I'd like to see kids doing, though, is not just using that virtual reality. I'd like to see them taking cameras out into their own areas, into their own spaces, into their own neighborhoods, discovering those neighborhoods, noticing things they've never noticed before, and creating their own virtual reality experiences for other people to have a look at. And with technology as it is now, we are moving to a even people without much ability or understanding of technology can do things through drag and drop, and so it's very easy to do that. But I would like to see more, and this is another important thing about schools. It's very siloed. I teach geography. My colleague teaches biology. My other colleague teaches design technology. There's not any crossover. We talk about it a lot in schools, but it rarely happens. So this project-based learning, where we can work across different curricula, because the world is not really siloed like that. The world is not really divided into geography and biology any more than the human body is really divided into a brain and a heart, and it's all working together, right, as a holistic unit. And so I think using technology to break down those silos also is something that could be explored, needs to be explored in schools.
Yeah, so I think I agree with you on that, Mr. David, where the Earth is not siloed like that, and even the title of our talk or our event is actually called "The Next Epoch," a multidisciplinary approach where all the great minds actually come together to produce greater things. And I also like the notion where you mentioned kids should actually go out and make or create their own virtual reality experience. So it sort of breaks them away from the user, and instead they're becoming a creator. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I want them to be the engineers, them to be the engineers, the creators of the software that might collect the data that we need in the future, rather than just being passive users of it.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, Mr. David, when talking about environmental science, I think there is a lot of talk on sustainability for the environment. So, when we're looking at technology versus nature, as we go on, as technology rages on, there's often a lot of energy being used in order to develop technology. So, how do we ensure that there is a fine balance of technology moving forward, but at the same time, it's sustainable and good for nature?
I think vast, huge steps have been taken in this area already. So when I was a business psychologist, I worked exclusively with the renewable energy industry. So all of my clients were in the renewable energy industry. And in the UK at the time, there was, and there is, a very big infrastructure build out of renewable energy. So I'm talking about large scale onshore wind and offshore wind, so utility scale solar facilities. All of these things are hugely technology reliant. So, for example, you might have a wind turbine which has loads of technology in it, talking to a control center 300 miles away, and that's collecting huge amounts of data on the performance of the machine, on wind speed and other on other aspects of performance related to that wind turbine and that wind farm in general. And we're also seeing smart grids happening, starting to be developed. So when one area is not producing enough wind power, can solar over here sort of take up the slack? And so there is this technology is allowing these different forms of generation in different geographical locations to talk to one another and to be able to communicate. And this is all coding behind this. This is all software that enables this to happen. But also even in our homes as well, we are seeing a move towards smart meters, which are giving us much more information about our energy usage in real time, rather than just getting a bill once a month. We can see what we're using on a minute by minute basis. We can see where we're perhaps being wasteful. And nobody wants to waste their money, right? Nobody wants to throw their money away. When we can see how much money we're throwing away, then it becomes easier to change our behavior. Because what we're talking about here is a massive shift in behavior. Yeah, so this, we're talking about technology and education, but what this boils down to is psychology and a shift in human behavior. And so at a basic level, we're looking at an antecedent which drives a behavior, which drives a consequence. So this might be a reward or a punishment. So if you have a smart meter in your house and you realize that you're losing money by not doing something, then you can change your behavior, save more. There's a reward there, right? Governments might implement a tax, for example. So that's a punishment as an antecedent driving a particular behavior. I think in Malaysia there's certainly where I live. I don't know about where you guys are in your experience, but I don't see what I'm using on a minute by minute basis. I get a piece of paper in my letterbox every month or 6 weeks telling me what I owe. So there's no opportunity for behavior change there. Also, petrol fuel is extremely cheap here, and so there isn't a lot of incentive there for people to change their behavior on that scope. But in terms of what this comes down to with ensuring sustainable use of resources in adaptation to technology, I think this is built in now. It's becoming built in. So there are legislative requirements now for technologies to meet certain criteria. If you're building a warehouse full of supercomputers, certainly in my own country, you will be required to meet sustainability criteria. There is no reason why all that heat that is being generated by those computers should not be being captured and used in some useful way rather than just disappearing up. So I think this is, and the way to think about this is to take an integrated approach. Instead of trying to sellotape, scotch tape a solution onto the end, it has to be engineered into the solution right from planning. But I think this is happening. This is happening more and more, ultimately because it makes good business sense not to be wasteful. So I think that I don't see this as being a massive problem going forward. And already you're seeing Google's centers being 100% renewable energy powered, etc. Of course, it will always take energy to manufacture things, but the question is where does that energy come from in the first place? How is it generated in the first instance?
All right, thank you so much for that, Mr. David. So I guess we're down to our last few questions. You mentioned that you want to be able to drag schools into the 21st century. So how do you picture education in the 21st century? And perhaps on a larger scale, what are your aspirations, visions, and goals?
Okay, so I think that education will change over the next kind of 10, 20, 30 years. I think that will be driven primarily by a reduction in the power of universities, as there are, for many subjects, more options available. For example, Google is rolling out micro degrees that are just more practical for their needs. You know, it goes back to that disconnect that I talked about between universities and employers. I think that parents are seeing schools not providing perhaps the 4.0 education that their parents need for the digital age. In Thailand, where I spend a lot of time, and where I will be relocating to in the near future, there were protests by students before COVID who were very unhappy with the government's lack of investment in digital skills, complaining that all you want for us is to have the right haircut and the right uniform, but actually that's not going to make a difference. You know, we need to have the right skills, and so I think there's a huge shift towards moving it in that direction. I think schools will have to change, but I think they will resist that change for as long as they can. I think a lot of it has to do with investment in education, you know, to be able to, for children to be able to use computers in a meaningful way so that they're not just, you know, consumers. They need to be given access to that. And so, you know, an access right now, even in international schools, can be, you know, sketchy, not always great. As for myself, I will be moving to Thailand to open a field centre. So, because I think there is a real lack of opportunity in outdoors. Geographical fieldwork, biological fieldwork is being eroded by the exams. For example, in my own subject, they have another exam paper now called Alternative to Fieldwork or Alternative to Coursework. There is no alternative to getting into a river and measuring it. You know, you can't replicate that by doing another exam. And so there is an element there of the tail wagging the dog. The exam boards are basically dictating how schools respond. And so there's too much power concentrated in the hands of exam boards. And the Cambridge syllabus, for example, is still using terms that geographers haven't used. So the Fieldwork Centre will be there to provide kids, not just privileged kids, but all kids with an opportunity to do field work. But you know, they will be using technology there. They will be using particular apps. They will be looking at. They'll be using microscopes and modern scientific equipment. You know, they'll be actually taking it into a pond, into a river, into a lake, or into a forest, and actually doing, you know, collecting real data, and then analysing that data and coming to their own conclusions, rather than just looking at figure one of the exam book. And so the idea is to give them a real experience and to enthuse them about science, about the natural world. Because for all our talk, governments talk about economies and these kinds of things. You can't have successful economies and successful societies without a successful environment. You need a healthy environment to support any of that. So it's about reconnecting children, I think. Technology is great, but I think the way that technology is being used by most children today is not great. And it's taking them out of nature. We need to reconnect them to nature, but in such a way that brings the technology with it in a useful way. And that's what the centre will be about, essentially.
Right, that's a very great idea, Mr. David, and I wish you all the best in this new center.
Thank you.
Where, yeah. So I guess as a closer, since I think most of our audiences are millennials, so I guess maybe you could offer some last piece of advice or parting messages before we end today's podcast.
Advice on
I think absolutely anything at all. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think what I see is parents valuing a very narrow set of subjects at school: physics, maths, more maths, a bit more maths, then some chemistry and some geography, and then a bit more maths. And listen, we don't develop well-rounded, functioning human beings by making them constantly do a very narrow set of subjects so they can pass an exam. I think that parents here are obviously concerned about their parent, like any parent wants their children to do well and to be successful. However, I think that in order to be successful in life, and I can see this from my previous role as a psychologist, just because you had good grades nowadays doesn't guarantee you the job, because there's a set of psychologists there between applicants and the job who are looking in far more detail than just exam grades about whether or not this person is going to get that role or not. And it's things such as personality, situational judgment, these kind of attributes that you just don't learn from exams. And so I would, instead of putting your children into extra maths classes on the evening or extra, STEM subjects, because tired brains don't learn, and after they've been in school for 6 hours, another 2 hours of doing this is not necessarily. There's a law of diminishing returns there. Let them join a football club or a swimming club, or take them to art class, or let them do something else, that is not connected to school, that is social, that involves them connecting with other children, that involves them talking and having fun, and not looking at maths problems and textbooks in another classroom environment, in an after school kind of establishment. That would be my advice. Develop the whole child, not just culturally valued subjects.
All right, thank you, Mr. David. I think that was some pretty practical advice, which is, I think, very much needed in today's culture. So I think that brings us to the end of today's podcast. So once again, I'd like to thank you so much for your time, Mr. David. And more than that, thank you for your valuable insights.